Welcome. This is the Drupal usability meeting for November 10th, 2023. I am Benji Fisher moderating, and also here are Ralph Kohler, who's sharing his screen and will start off the discussion, and Aaron McHale, Emma Harrell, and Simo Helston. Thank you all for coming. Go ahead, Ralph.
We are looking at issue number, oops, that's a long one.
I think it's 2794481.
It's allow end date to be optional. I can go quickly through the applied patch and then we can have a discussion. Because at the bottom, Laurie, oops, I have to reload that, has left a comment a few hours ago about the intended functionality behind. It's basically if you create a new field, you have the date range, and that's one detail I would have expected it would be found underneath date and time as one of the available options, but it's a dedicated one. So
don't forget a label.
Yep. But I go into the content type I've already created and added the date range field there. I've limited it to 1, and the option is basically either you are able to have the required field, and then the patch adds the optional end date. And it might be good quickly read Laurie's comment about it. I haven't looked in the merge request yet, but the checkbox shouldn't have anything to do with the required checkbox. The required checkbox controls if the date time range field must contain a value. The new checkbox added here defines what is a valid value for the date time range field, whether we expect to always have a pair of start and end, or can we accept just the start date? The new setting should impact the validation even when the field is not required. If the field is not marked as required, the end date should be still required when the user enters a start date. And about the optional date, the other detail why chops put it back to needs work or review is allows end date to be optional, opposed to the default behavior where end date is required when required field is checked, which is a bit difficult to comprehend. And from my personal perspective, when I used it, I was under the impression that the optional end date would depend on the required field, and that was also the Hops impression, but it is not the case. So let's go into an example. Let's create a date. One date. A few different scenarios we could quickly go through. You're able to save that without anything entered. That is possible. You're able to just enter the start date. End date is required, you get then. But the other way around is also possible. And then you get a bit of a cryptic, this value should not be null, which is not very helpful.
And both the start date and end date are highlighted, which also seems odd.
Yep, indeed. And also, under my impression, when I first got to it, I thought required field is not checked. So basically, I should be able to do anything. Meaning, it isn't intended, but you still should be able to either add a start date or an end date or both, all should be basically possible, but yeah. Anyway, we could quickly set the required field now. Just do a reload, cancel, oops, go back. Now both the start and end date have the red star for being required. And we could go quickly through. Let's test that. Now you get the HTML5 form validation.
And we get that validation because we've marked it as required. Is that?
Yeah. That was before. That works. And now, oops, let's set the optional end date. It's also working. So that's basically it. Any questions or suggestions to test?
So just a quick point, there's a lot to consider here in terms of usability. There's the usability of the admin form, whether to use a checkbox, whether to use radio buttons or some other widget, what the help text should be. And then there's also the usability of this edit form that we're looking at now. And when validation should happen, whether it should be marked with an asterisk, and so on. So at least two screens that we have to look at when we consider usability. And Simo asks in the chat, error message, Rangers end date. Is that an English word or typo? And Rangers comes from the field name, yes.
Yeah.
Any other questions about what this problem was trying to address? So what should we discuss? The admin form or for setting up the field, or the content editing form for entering data in the field?
Well, we're already here, so maybe the admin form.
Okay. And I think Larry's point is already implemented. This like we're not using progressive disclosure to expose this option only when it's required. It does seem to be independent of whether the field is required or not.
Yep. But that is not directly apparent because, as I said, I was under the impression it would be dependent just based on using the functionality and reading the description for optional end date checkbox.
My first impression with that label optional end date was because kind of if the person forgets where he or she is at, then kind of it feels like it's adding something, and unchecking it's kind of reverts it back to date, just a single date. So that's kind of, it could be better labeled there. So kind of optional end date, it doesn't say if it makes the end date optional or if it kind of includes or removes the end date from there. So it could be clearer.
Yeah, I would definitely think we could make this easier to understand if progressive disclosure was used. So Ralph, just to confirm, if you uncheck required, the fields, that's still shown, right?
Yep.
Because yeah. Okay, so like when required isn't checked, we shouldn't show that because it only makes sense if the field's required, right?
No,
So,
No.
oh, it
And-
doesn't?
and that's Larry's point.
Yep.
So, wait, okay.
It
One
shouldn't
second.
have anything to do with the required checkbox. That's what Larry said.
Yeah.
And I think that Ralph's demo indicated that it doesn't have anything to do with required.
Yep.
So just to throw out a couple of ideas, I don't know if these are good ideas or not, but just possibilities. One idea is that we could make it radio buttons instead of a checkbox. And it's sort of a weird reason for doing that is that it would be visually distinct from the required field checkbox, so that might lessen the confusion that the two are somehow related. Another idea is that maybe this shouldn't be a property of the field. Maybe this should be a property of the field storage. And yeah, again, it's sort of a bad reason for doing that, but it would separate it from the required option. But then the more important consideration of whether we should do that or not is what is the expectation when reusing this field?
Well, I think, you know, the whether a field is required or not is kind of independent of storage. And obviously we've established that this particular option isn't related to required field, but the end result is that like whether when this option is checked or unchecked, it requires the user to do something that they otherwise might not be able to do. So I feel like there's a sort of very loose, albeit somewhat existing pattern there that this kind of behavior I feel like shouldn't go to the field storage level. But I now understand what you're saying, and I do think a radio buttons might make this easier to convey, because also then there's potential for a further evolved version that could, you know, say, okay, the start date is optional, but the end date is required, right? That could be, I don't know if you can make that with the current implementation, but at least there's some radio buttons would allow for those additional kind of options in the future
There
if
is
they were needed.
There's a follow-up issue or plan for a follow-up issue to add the ability to have an optional start date.
Okay, so I definitely think radio buttons might make this easier to convey, and as Benji said, also making them kind of like a bit more distinct from the required checkbox, and also maybe moving the checkbox to be further up, closer to like maybe just again to create some different sort of just make it clear that this is not related to whether a field is required, but like maybe moving the checkbox to a different part of the form might help too.
Yeah, I think for consistency, we'd want it underneath the help text, but we could move it above the checkbox for required field.
Right.
But Simo, what is it you want to say?
Yeah, I was thinking that like in my mind, optional end date is connected to field store, like connected to the allowed number of values. So those are like connected in my brain. So this kind of so I would like to see the optional end date in the same place, but for purposes of the CMS, it doesn't make sense because this could be used different ways in different places. The field, so fields it shouldn't be in field storage, but they are kind of connected in my cognition. But at least I was also thinking that moving it above the required field would definitely help, not confusing the kind of the hierarchical, what was this word, the kind of so that it would obviously not be limited by the required checkbox.
Okay, Aaron, go ahead.
So just building on this train of thought. So if we went with radio buttons, could that incorporate the functionality of the required fields checkbox? Because with the when you check required field, doesn't that make then both the start and end date required? So then if we had radio buttons, we could phrase it in a way where it's like one of them is nothing is required, one of them is start date's required, and the other one is start and end date required. And maybe that's a way to make this really clear and try and reconcile the distinction between those different options.
That's an interesting thought. Go ahead, Ralph.
Yeah.
But with the options you've outlined, Aaron, I'm not sure, because my main problem is basically if the required field is not checked, and then you still have the not communicated constraints still. So basically, required field unchecked, start date entered, end date empty, you get an error. The other way around, the same, and that is not covered if you say there are no constraints. And that's my main problem with the feature at the moment, that it's not clear.
So is that maybe it would help if you demonstrate that, because is that in my head that's basically the equivalent of saying the start and end date are required?
No, basically that's what I've initially, 1 second, I just save. I've unchecked required field and I've unchecked optional end date, so nothing is checked. But still, if you go in there, go to edit, if it's empty, both, save, it works.
Okay.
No constraint. If you enter now, you get an error.
Oh, yeah.
And if you do that, you get an even more cryptic error.
But okay, this scenario is the equivalent of saying no, it isn't. Sorry. No, I've just broken my train of thought now. Damn. Okay.
Okay, let's let
And
Sibo go ahead. He's been waiting for a few minutes.
Well, actually, that error message, the value should not be null. That's something that's kind of should be fixed anyways. It's a different issue. Yeah, I'm thinking that I like the idea of having radio buttons. So in this case, it would make sense. But I'm a little bit worried that because we are used to seeing those checkboxes for required fields, it's everywhere. So it's kind of having one place where it would be radio buttons. That would be a little bit confusing, or kind of at least for some people. So I would very much like to have it the same everywhere, so that it's easily recognizable and like without thinking.
Yeah, we're getting a thumbs up from Ralph on that point, and I also agree. Emma asks in the chat, could the help text under required field help to clarify so users know what to expect when they select it? And that's tied into the same thing. The required checkbox is present on every field form, whether it needs more explanation or not is sort of out of scope, because I think it should be consistent, and probably it's common enough that that it doesn't need additional explanation. And that's a pretty strong argument against eliminating that checkbox and integrating it with the options for start and end date to be optional. But go ahead, Aaron.
yeah, that's a great point. And having consistency across field types is good. I wonder if we could maybe take a look at another field type that has results in multiple like form fields. I'm thinking about the link field as a good example, because the link field has both URL and text components, and I think you can I think it also has options to like say, okay, text is not required kind of thing. Or maybe that's another issue. But I guess we'll find out in a second once Ralph creates one. But I think that might be like if there's something that works in Link, maybe that's somewhere where we can draw some inspiration. Yeah, so Link is using radio buttons, and Link text has radio buttons. Yeah, that might be yeah, maybe that's a good pattern to follow actually, because again, it's thinking about consistency. If it's consistent with like how Link behaves, then that's already something we could replicate.
So instead of kind of something like hello link text, so that kind of that label could be something like required parts. Would that make sense? And then
Yeah. I was thinking like, yeah, allowed, so like for end date, you could have like maybe you could just say like end date, and then you would have the options for like optional and required.
yeah. But then again, we could use the same like internal links only, external links only. We could use start date only, end date only, both
Right.
start and end
Yeah.
date.
And I see that, is it Sime or Ralph says your actual name is C. Hobbs, has joined us.
Hi there. You just say Simon, yeah.
Simon, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, or Simon.
Okay.
I don't believe that optional start date is in the scope of that work, by the way.
I think it's a suggested follow-up issue.
Yeah, I think it makes it very complex, and I think they kept that out of scope for the issue as it was.
But as with
it's
assigning,
probably worth considering though that might be on the pathway.
exactly, as we're discussing the structure of the admin form, we want to keep that in mind. And what Ralph is showing right now is the configuration form for link field. And we think that following the same pattern might be a good idea and would allow us to add an additional radio button when that issue, when and if that issue is worked on. I see I get a thumbs up from Simon. Okay, so are we settled on this then, that we should recommend following the example of the link text field and turning it from a checkbox into radio buttons? I get a thumbs up from Simo. And a
Do
thumbs
we
up from
want to
Simon.
be any more prescriptive, or do we just want to leave it kind of open-ended and let the issue figure it out? Because, like, for instance, we don't want we probably don't want the disabled option, I would imagine.
I would say we should go for that version allowed link type. So that's kind of more like the start end.
Oh, okay.
So it could be something like,
So in this case, without the option to leave out start date, it could be like a start date only, both start and end date.
Yeah, okay.
But then it's kind of, oh, now I'm thinking, yeah, allowed link. So it's, yeah, that would, I think, cover it. So you're allowed to have only start date. No.
yeah, for this issue, the start date is always going to be required when the field is used. And the only option is whether the end date is required. So I think that the field label could be simply end date, and then the two radio buttons could be optional and required.
Yeah, and then like in a follow-up issue, there's always scope for a follow-up issue to expand or change that when that's being considered, when the start date is in scope. So let's keep it simple and well scoped for now. Makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think I agree. It makes sense in this phase. Yeah.
Okay, we get a thumbs up from Ralph. Okay, so that's the admin form, and we get a thumbs up from Emma. So I think we have some consensus there. Do we want to think any more about whether it should be a part of the field storage rather than the field options? And I guess I said it before, the real consideration there should be what the expectation is when you reuse the field.
I've as a site builder, I've always felt that this should be something that you can toggle on and off, that and that it feels right that got moved to the widget, to the instance. So yeah, I mean that I always, and I noticed the conversation, I think that Lara Len, maybe and Jess had somewhere back up in the thread had reflected that kind of view as well, that there was certainly a lot of relief that it was being moved to the instance. So I feel like that's kind of got discussed, and that it'd be a pretty big thing to push it back into the storage.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think if we're following existing patterns, like we said, it makes sense that that would live on the instance rather than storage level.
Okay.
And also, it would be then located, the radio buttons in that same place with where the link options are.
Good point. Okay, I think we're done looking at the admin form. Should we also discuss? Oh, go ahead, Ralph.
Just one question. When the component is changed to a radio button, should the description be striked, or would it still be necessary? I'm not sure, because with optional and required, it's sort of more clear.
That is always the goal, that you don't need the help text, and I kind of think that turning it into radio buttons achieves that.
Yeah, and we see the example with a link that like the fields, the equivalent form element with the link field is very self-explanatory. So I don't think
you're taking the logical path of the sentence and you're splitting it into two physically different things. I totally agree that does achieve that.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we consider what happens on the content edit form, or is that not being changed in this? I think it must be affected by this issue.
I think the only difference is you wouldn't get an error, like if there's no end date. I mean, maybe we could recommend no, because like it's not even like there's error message text to recommend. We're just
But still, I would definitely change the error message for if you enter an end date and no start date. That is totally not clear. Oops.
But is that in scope for the current issue? Is that any different from what happens if you try that? without the patch.
Well, that's not great. What happened then? Yeah, it might. You saying that there was already issues there. That is true. From my experience, I've avoided the date range field for these reasons, regardless of whether the end date was optional or not.
It does seem
So
out of scope, but it's not. It's yeah. Like if it was a follow-up issue,
I think it's worthy of a follow-up issue. Yeah, I think I like giving a very clear indication that we think a follow-up issue is valid, and having that, making sure that that's sort of created and it's kind of called out, I guess.
mm-hmm. The only thing that I can think of is that like there's a certain situation where, and again, maybe this is out of scope too, but this like if you right now if you enter a start date and then not an end date, with the end date being optional, so like, or is that gonna, yeah, it's just, I think this is I think this is a follow-up issue, because what we're doing is like removing
Oh,
the
it was-
situations and where you get an error, but I think we need there needs to be some consideration to communicating ahead of time, like that when you enter a start date, like you also have to enter an end date, like how, like maybe using JavaScript to add in that asterisk or something. I'm not 100% sure, but again, probably a follow-up issue to like just consider that, because while it's not related, like that's a problem right now, regardless of this issue. I think it's something that we at least can highlight as a good follow-up candidate.
Okay. So maybe it needs some more careful review. But if it is the case that we're showing strictly fewer errors with this change, then it's not part of the current issue, but there clearly is some room for improvement in the errors on this form.
Right.
It also, unblocking this as being a more usable field has benefits. It then gets people using it, and I think one of the reasons why it's sort of a bit stagnant is people don't use it.
Yeah, I just tested on a site without the patch applied, and if I try to fill in the end date only, then I get the same unhelpful error message. This value should not be null, and both fields are highlighted. So I think that's the same behavior that we see with the patch. So I see a thumbs up from Ralph. So definitely should be fixed, but is not in scope for the current issue, right?
Yep.
Okay. And a thumbs up from Aaron. Anything more to say on this issue? We get a heart from Simon. Thank you. Okay, and who wants to post a comment on the issue? Simon, would you like to report the results of this?
I'm happy to report the results, noting that it's late at night here, so I might need someone to correct me or fill in some gaps. I might draft it in the channel tomorrow morning if that's all right. And then,
That's fine.
okay.
And I'll give you a little boilerplate we can use as a framework for the comment.
Yeah, that would be helpful. That would be my first doing anything like this. So yeah.
Yeah.
But I'll come back into the Slack channel tomorrow.
Great. Okay. We have almost 15 minutes left. Is there some other issue that we think we can discuss in that amount of time? Simon, you also added make description field labels consistent on the issue. I think that's something that we've looked at.
Yeah, last week we reviewed it.
Yeah, if it was, I just did want to ask a question. Something that I was wondering about was, what do we have is there a formal or a way or a practice of determining reading level of text? Is there a service that we use as a standard, or
Okay,
like for example?
Well,
Yeah,
slow down. Just for the sake of the recording, let's say this is issue 3365222. Make description field labels consistent. Ralph has brought it up. And maybe is there some screenshot on the issue that we can use to give context? I guess not, but if you go to
No. Was basically, for example,
admin structure, anything add, typically. For content type, we have the description field. When adding a new menu, instead of calling it description, we have something called administrative summary. And the issue is about making those consistent.
Yep.
Okay, and I know most of us have already looked at this recently, but Emma, you weren't. Do you need any more context on this?
I think what you've said is enough for now.
Okay.
But yeah, till we get into the meat of it, I might have more questions. So
Simon, your question again?
No, I was just taking the opportunity to change the topics. I'll stay. If there was space at the end of the meeting, I wanted to ask a question not related to this.
Oh, I'm sorry. So your question was, do we have guidelines for interface text?
Yeah. Yeah. Is there a standard way of testing a piece of text?
I don't know if there's a standard way of testing, but we do have some guidelines.
Yeah, there's the interface text standards maybe need updating. I've thought about for about a year updating them. But I don't think we have like a specific tool like you asked, like one that we recommend. But I know with the prevalence of AI generative, language models, maybe I don't know, maybe that's something that there's something that could help with it.
So I pasted a link into the Zoom chat and Ralph has opened it. So that's our guide on user interface standards.
Thanks.
Isn't there another page, a single page as well somewhere? I thought there was.
Well, maybe you're thinking of the child page on interface text.
That might be, yeah.
You did scroll past it.
Yeah, it's at the bottom.
Ah, there. Yeah, that one. Yep.
Yeah, just as a comment, like I noticed, like if I went to just Googled a reading level website and I put the text from the issue I was looking at into it, it highlighted many issues with that piece of text, and syllables, and how many syllables in the sentence and so forth in it. And I wondered if there was if you post something like that, is it just deemed to be kind of, do people kind of take to it if you sort of suggest it? Because you could rewrite the sentence and clear it up and make it simpler and get an A+ on these same websites in terms of readability level and so forth.
I think that would be useful to have that kind of guideline or some kind of guides and instructions on how to do it, how to test it.
Yeah, I usually it's content editors I'm working with who do all that sort of stuff. I'm not used to doing it myself.
Yeah, so I think the goal is understood, but we don't have any specific standards of readability or tools for checking it that I've seen used before.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
So yeah, it's probably good to have a tool like that we trust.
I think that's always that last thing that we trust is always going to be the hard part. It's like picking a tool that we can confidently say is going to give us reliable results, and it's going to make recommendations that are actually helpful, because when we review things, and this is like one of the benefits of this meeting, is we can review interface text here and we can make a good recommendation, usually based on our best judgment. And quite often we'll say, okay, that we'll use the principle of less is more. So if you can use less words to convey the same thing. And that's essentially what we did on the previous issue. We took the description text and said, well, not only is there a shorter way to this, but actually, is there a better interaction pattern? That means we don't need it to begin with. So I think it's a bit more, so there's a bit more nuance than simply like what is the reading age, but certainly like as a sort of first check, as a sense check, like a initial first pass. That's what I was trying to say. Certainly, like if there is a tool that we can trust and recommend, then that may be helpful. But I don't think it's a substitute necessarily, at least not yet, for what we do at these meetings, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it. I mean, just going onto an issue and sort of saying, hey, just as a really quick idea, this sentence, if it's written like this, and just get people into the headspace of it. I realize that a lot of people, like we've got people who don't have English as their first language and stuff like that, and they're probably just relieved to have someone else come along and, fine tune the language a little bit. But I wasn't sure about the etiquette.
And I think it's helpful that on this meeting, we currently have two people whose first language is not English. Go ahead, Ralph.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, one idea is something that was also suggested in the context of accessibility, but in the context of readability and microcopy, would it make sense, or I'm not sure if it's possible, but in the context of Drupalize Me, I've read a blog post by, I guess it was Joel Schindler, that they have some sort of automated tests for text quality in place for Drupalize Me. And if it would be possible to apply the same sort of linters to text strings within the Drupal code base, and that way to have at least a first level of check against a certain quality, and then you can still take a proper further check in, for example, a usability meeting, but that at least sentences like that are clearly apparent, not clear or hard to read, would be avoided in the first place, and the people creating the patch put a bit more thought and a bit of work into that in the first place, and it would be maybe easier to understand for the in-person review afterwards as well.
automation might also help with the cases where I just write something here and fix it later and never gets fixed.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, so if there is some sort of automation, it might also help to notice stuff like when somebody writes something and it's kind of not really thought through, and just somebody thinks, I'll just fill in here something and then I'll fix it later, but then forgets to fix. So if there is automation checking, it might help to spot also this kind of slacking.
Yeah, I think Joe Schindler is, his username on Drupal.org is EOJ the Brave, and he's active in documentation. So I think if someone wants to post a message in the documentation channel asking him for advice, he can probably help identify some tools that we might use. Would anyone like to follow up on that?
I'm interested in that, so I will follow up on that.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have just a few minutes before the hour. Remember, Drupal 10.2 is coming soon. I think the beta is scheduled for next week. Anything else you want to say before we wrap? Ralph?
Just one quick question. Could I post a draft for an issue? I went through the still open usability meeting issues the last few days and went chronological backwards. And about 4 weeks ago, we talked about the extend page, and it was at the end of the meeting, and we forgot to agree on someone to write up a comment, and I went through it the last few days and summarized it. But in particular, the last part in regard of the recommendation, I'm not sure if it is phrased appropriately, because it's basically invalidating most of the work that was already done on the issue, and feels always a bit strange, and I want to phrase it gently. And if anyone of the people who attended back then could take a look.
Yeah, let's first of all, thanks for doing it. And I often do the same thing, try to control the issues that are haven't been resolved. But let's continue that discussion in Slack. And certainly over the next few weeks, I'm also working on that backlog. Thomas, I'm afraid you forgot about the time change. This meeting is scheduled in UTC, and the US just ended daylight savings time. So we're just wrapping up. Any other last words? Okay. Thanks again. We'll do this again in a week at 1400 UTC. And again, thanks all for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everyone.